So today's Tanya is going to get a little controversial, um, but that's just a hook for when I post this on YouTube. Uh, so let's just summarize what we talked about until now, and that is we talked about the difference between holiness and unholiness, or what we call in Kabbalistic terms klipa. So it's not only thought, speech, and deed in forbidden matters that come from the soul of klipa. Uh, But even thought, speech, and deed that's just not directly serving Hashem are associated with klipa, with the other side, the side that is not holy. And that's why it's referred to in Kabbalah, in the Aramaic, it's called Sitra Achra, which literally translates as the other side, meaning anything that is not on the side of holiness is automatically bad and against holiness. Lahavdil, you have certain politicians, which I won't name, that either you're on their team or you are, against them. They don't have this concept of like, maybe some people could be neutral, right? So I think, um, without ascribing any deep meaning to that, but I think it's a great analogy for what goes on in holiness. That either something is serving God, but if it's not serving God, then it's opposing God. There's no neutrality when it comes to holiness or unholiness. Because what is holiness? The side of holiness is basically something where godliness dwells. And where can God dwell? What's a good, a Boeing 747 can't land on a little landing strip. It has to land on a proper runway, right? So God has to land on somewhere that's, appropriate for God to land, for God to dwell. Where does God dwell? God dwells somewhere that is nullified to him, somewhere that's subservient to God and puts itself aside for God. And so, therefore, the Jewish people are called the side of holiness because they have the power of Mesiras Nefesh, the power to give themselves up, to give up their lives for the sake of God. And so that power, that ability, that gift that we have, which, by the way, we inherited from our forefather Abraham, the father of Mesiras Nefesh, that makes us a worthy vessel for God's dwelling. Meaning, even if we're not necessarily acting upon that power in the moment, but the fact that we can, that already, makes us a candidate, shall we say, for somewhere to God, for God to dwell. Now, anything that does not nullify itself to godliness receives its life force from the other side of holiness, which is basically the side that is not making itself nullify towards God, but is also only existing because of God, because nothing can exist without God. And so, how's that possible? How can God dwell somewhere where it's not being welcome? The answer is God dwells there in an exiled format, meaning God is trapped in that thing, so to speak, trapped not in the sense that it cannot escape. God can just cause it to cease to exist. But it's trapped in the sense that it's not visible, it's not present, it's not you're not aware of God's presence within that thing. And that's why this entire world, or the vast majority of this world, which is not subservient to God, is called the world of klipas. And things in this world are difficult, they're bad, and there's a lot of evil in this world. Why? Because if it's not openly, outwardly serving God, then it's going to default to the other side. Now, within the other side, within the klipas, within the shells, within the husk, the protective layer that hides godliness from certain entities, there are two different types of klipas. So that's where we're up to now after the shaded box in chapter 6. um, talking about the three klipos that have no good in it at all. So the Alter Rebbe says like this: Elo shahaklipas enachlakais l'shtei madregos. But the klipos are divided into two levels. Zu lemata mizu. This one lower than the other one. So even though in general everything in this world is called the world of klipos, nevertheless there is a fundamental distinction between things that are allowed in this world and things that are not allowed, right? There's a big difference between eating a kosher fish for pleasure versus eating shellfish, right? Kosher fish for purely for pleasure is also klipa. It's also not holy. If you're eating the kosher fish to honor Shabbos, okay, so then you made it holy. But otherwise, it's not holy. But still, there's a difference between that and eating something like shellfish, which is completely unkosher, right? Why is that? Because in the powers of klipa, there are two general categories. In other words, there's two different ways in which the husk, the shell, covers over the godly light in it. Obviously, tuna fish and crab both have godliness in it. For if it didn't, it wouldn't exist, right? But there's a big difference in how godliness is covered. So over here, he's going to talk about the completely impure klipas, and in chapter 7, he's going to go into the shining klipa. So we'll see what that is there. So hamadrega tachtaina, the lower level of these klipas, these shalish klipas atmeis verais lagamri, are the three impure klipas that are completely bad. In other words, they cover completely any holiness in it to such an extent that godly light is not visible in them. And those klipas are generally divided into three different categories or three different titles. He doesn't go into what those titles are over here. Actually, he says it briefly over here. The Ein Bahem Taiv Klal, and they have no good in them at all. Now, obviously, they do have something good. They have the godly spark, which keeps them alive. But what it means is that there is no visible good in them at all. V'nikru b'merkavas Yecheskel, and they're referred to in the chariot of Yecheskel. So I'm going to briefly share my screen over here, if I can do that. Let's see. I think this is important to have context. So over here we have Chabad.org, Yecheskel, Ezekiel, chapter 1. So it talks about the prophecy. I saw visions of God. This is the vision of Ezekiel, says when it was. And so this is what I saw. Verse 4. And I saw, Ba'ira, and behold, a tempest was coming from the north. So a tempest in simple English means a big wind coming from the north. And then he says, so that's one, okay? And then he says, Anan Gadol, a huge cloud. And thirdly, and a flaming fire with a brightness around it. And from its midst, it was like the color of the chashmal from the midst of the fire. So again, we have wind, cloud, and fire, okay? And then it talks about living beings. And anyways, we're not going to go through the whole thing now, but I just wanted to share that little excerpt. So, according to the commentaries on that verse, this verse is talking about powers that came to destroy the Jewish people, sometimes in the form of wind, sometimes in the form of a cloud or fire. But Chassidus and the mystical side of Torah explains that these powers, the wind, the fire, and the cloud, are really three types of impurity. What we call the shalish klipas atmeis, the three completely impure klipas. Now, there isn't a lot that explains like, which things in this world fall under the category of cloud or fire or wind. That's not really, there's not a lot written on that. But just this idea of the number three, that there's three types of klippas, three types of, negative forces out there, so to speak, that comes from this verse. So from here until the end of chapter 6, the Alter Rebbe will explain which things get their vitality from the three completely impure klippas. And basically, the gist of what he's saying is that since the godly light in these forces of impurity are completely hidden, therefore the things that result from them are things that are completely forbidden, and they're tied down, and they're tied down to impurity, and we have to distance ourselves from them and not to use them even for a good purpose, because we don't have the ability to reveal any good in them. This is if you were here at our mythology event, I was talking about this concept, how we have, even when we're eating food, even when we're eating kosher food, we have to use it for an altruistic purpose. We have to use it to elevate it to something greater than ourselves, to godliness, right? But the term asur, which means forbidden, also comes from the word asur, which is tied down, meaning most things are mutar, they're untied, meaning they're neutral, they're lying there in wait for us to grab it and utilize it and elevate it for something holy. But other things are tied down, they're imprisoned, they're stuck, they're incarcerated in the realm of impurity, and we don't have a way to elevate them. And that's basically the key difference between tuna fish and shellfish, right? Tuna fish is untied. Doesn't make it holy. It's still unholy. It's not godly. Tuna fish feels that it's tuna fish. It doesn't feel godliness. But when we consume it and we use that consciousness towards God to serve God, then we just elevated that, and we took something that was untied and we tied it to godliness. Whereas the shellfish, it's tied to impurity, and it's not within our ability or within our right to untie it. So now let's see some of the examples that he gives. I don't know if he uses tuna fish and shellfish, but let's see. So the souls of the nations of the world are drawn from these three impure klippas. And as the Alter Rebbe said at the end of chapter 1, that they come from the three klipos that don't have any good in them. This is where the part that I said is controversial. And v'kiyum gufam, and their bodies as well. So meaning that the existence of the body itself, meaning it does not come from the soul in it, because even when the soul leaves the body still exists. So what keeps that body existing? We're not talking about keeping the body alive, because we're talking about keeping the body existing, just like a stone exists and an apple exists. What keeps the body in existence? So there is a godly power which keeps the body in existence. And even this godly power, which is where the bodies of nations of the world come from, that godly power is covered over in klippas. And those klippas are completely bad, and they have no visible godliness in them. Again, of course, there's a spark of godliness, but not one that is able to be released. And this is actually one of the areas in Tanya where it was censored, because the Alter Rebbe didn't want the Russian authorities to see that he's writing that Jews are different than non-Jews, and it is a little bit of a difficult thing to understand. What does that mean? That mean that non-Jews are bad? So one explanation that I've heard is that this book is written for Jews, and what we're saying is that for a Jew, you cannot elevate a non-Jew in the sense that, you cannot make a holy union between a Jew and a non-Jew. And so that's what it means, that relative to the Jewish person who's engaging with them, they cannot elevate that. Now, the same way a non-Jew could eat shellfish, a non-Jew could engage in a relationship with a non-Jew. But we're talking about from the Jewish perspective, they're forbidden. But anyways, like I said, it's a little sensitive, but let's move on to the next example. And the souls of all living beings which are prohibited and forbidden from eating. Here's where shellfish is an example of that. V'kiyum gufam, and the existence of their body. So again, there's the soul that keeps them alive, right? Because animals are living beings, but also the actual matter of their body as well. V'kiyum v'chayus kol ma'acholes asuros me'atzameach, and also the existence and the life. Over here, he doesn't say soul, but he says life of all forbidden food that comes from the ground. Like, for example, you're not allowed to eat fruit from a tree the first 3 years after it's planted. So it's called arla. It's the same word as a uncircumcised child. That there's like a foreskin which is blocking you from a certain access. And similarly, this tree has like a blockage. You can't eat from that tree for the first 3 years. Also, there is a prohibition against planting mixed species together, crossbreeding, even in plants. By the way, that prohibition only extends so far as doing the act of crossbreeding plants. But if a non-Jew crossbred plants, a Jew is allowed to eat them. But still, the idea that there can be prohibitions, that there can be something that's tied down to the side of impurity, exists within food. As it's written in the Eitz Chaim, which is a Kabbalistic work, Gate 49, Chapter 6. So, in other words, there are things from both the living category and the growing category that are prohibited from their initial coming into being, because their life force comes from the three prohibited klipas, meaning it's not that they became prohibited by an act of humankind afterwards, but they're just prohibited as is, like prohibited animals, because they're considered impure, as opposed to, say, for example, an ox that was grown as a kosher animal, but then had to be stoned to death, as it talks about in Parshas Mishpatim, that oxen sometimes, in certain scenarios, because they killed someone or whatever, they need to be stoned to death. So the meat of that ox now became prohibited, right? So that's a different category. And when we're talking about the things that grow, both arla, the first 3 years of a fruit tree, or vineyard mixtures are prohibited from the beginning of their growth. Those things come from the three prohibited klipas, from the three completely impure klipas. And then we're up to the last line and a half of this chapter. And the same is true with the life force and the existence of every deed, speech, or thought associated with any of the 365 negative commandments and offshoots of those negative commandments, as explained there in Eitz Chaim. So these deeds, speech, and thoughts of a person are they exist from something above, and when a person violates meaning our ability to think, speak, or act comes from a source higher than ourselves. And when a person violates one of these 365 negative commandments, whether in deed, speech, or thought, that you're now you're receiving nourishment from the side of absolute impurity. In other words, the physical energy which you used in order to violate a certain commandment got its life force from the side of impurity. So just to, I know we're kind of almost at the time limit, but hold on. Just to explain a little further, just like learning Torah and doing mitzvahs are the paths through which a person can connect himself and attach himself with godliness, so too the Torah prohibited certain thoughts, speech, and deed because they separate a person from godliness. So lighting a Hanukkah candle is a way to attach to God. Speaking Lashon Hara, talking negatively about someone, that severs your connection with God. And that's because the very existence, the life force of these things come from a negative place. They come from the three impure klipos, which are completely devoid of godliness. You cannot see any godliness there at all. And when a person connects himself with those klipos, God forbid, he is bestowing upon himself, unfortunately, a part of these three negative klipos. And that causes a separation, a gap between you and Hashem. So from here we see that the garments of the animal soul, the thought, speech, and deed of all the negative commandments are much more impure than the soul itself, because the animal soul by a Jew comes from, as we said at the end of chapter 1, it comes from the shining klipa, which we're going to talk about in chapter 7. But the actual thought, speech, and deed that's utilized for something prohibited comes from the lower form of the klipas. So this goes back to what we were saying in the beginning of the chapter, that everything is equal Pasquale. There's the side of holiness and there's the side of impurity. And when we do a mitzvah, we are tapping into the side of holiness. When we do something that's the opposite of a mitzvah, we are tapping into the side of impurity and bestowing that energy upon ourselves. And so that is the fairness that takes place in our everyday lives, and the choice we have to be able to either receive energy and vitality from the side of the three completely impure klippas, or we can do a mitzvah and attach ourselves to godliness. So in short, what we were saying in this last section is that within klippas there are two levels. The lower level is the three completely impure klippas that have no good in it, and that's where the souls and bodies of nations of the world come from, and all things that grow and live, which Jews are not allowed to eat. That's where their vitality comes from. And also the life force and the vitality of any thought or any speech or any action that is against what Hashem wants comes from this lower level of klipa. And God willing, next week we'll discuss the shining klipa in chapter 7.